Our first berries are beginning to turn red and ripen up for us, and we've really got a good fruit set this year, even though they're a little bit late, and that's because of the fact that we put on that heavy mulch during the winter time, and so it took them a little while for them to come back after we pull the mulch back, but that's okay because we salvage them from any of those late freezes that we might have. Now when you're harvesting your strawberries, you want to remember to always leave this calyx on there because that will actually help them store a little bit longer. And so you just pop them off with the calyx, and those that are the ripest are very perishable, so you need to get them inside and get them in refrigeration as soon as you can. It's also a good idea to try to harvest the strawberries early in the morning or late in the afternoon or evening when the temperatures are a lot cooler. Well, now that we've got several harvested, let's take some into the kitchen and see what Barb has for us today using strawberries as a jam. Barb, it looks like we have a recipe today using one of our favorite early fruits, the strawberry, and then one that's not so favorite with some people, and I think more or less it's because people really don't know how to grow it. What are we going to do today?
We're going to make strawberry rhubarb jam. Two of my favorites, actually. I grew up eating both of them. In fact, they used to find me in the strawberry patch fighting turtles to make sure that I got the most of the strawberries. So these are definitely some favorites of mine. There are some things to know about rhubarb, though. I think most people are familiar with strawberries. As you said, rhubarb's a little bit less familiar. One of the things to remember about it is that it is a stalk. Looking for bright red ones is advisable, not necessarily for ripeness as much as simply because it provides the dish a lot more color later on. You will need to cut the bottom off simply because this part is not particularly edible, but the more important is to cut the leaf off the top because that does contain some toxins or some poisons, and we don't want anybody to eat the wrong part of the rhubarb stalk.
Now what if we wanted to store it though before we eat it? Do we need to leave the top on?
I would leave the top on. I put it in a plastic bag or some kind of container that would be relatively airtight and would retain moisture around it so that it doesn't get real limp.
In the refrigerator?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay, now what we're going to do is we have chopped some rhubarb relatively fine. You don't want to get it too fine because with jam you want to know what you're getting. So we've chopped it up so that we have relatively small pieces but still identifiable in the jam. There's about a cup of rhubarb here, and we're going to mix that or cook that with 1/4 of a cup of water. And to save a little bit of time, I've done that ahead of time. We want to basically just get it soft. The recipe says cook those together for about 1 minute. I found that was still a little bit too crisp, so I cooked mine a little bit longer than that. But,
and that's what we've ended up with here then.
Right. So that those just go on the burner, cook for a short period of time. We have then measure this out. Excuse me, this will be a pound of rhubarb, and we're going to measure that out so that when it's cooked we have a cup of cooked. Now these we're going to put our rhubarb, which is basically a rhubarb sauce now minus the sugar, into a large pan. It's important at this point that you do use a large pan because with jams and jelly products they tend to bubble up. We're going to make it come to a full rolling boil and continue at that for a period of time, and if you're not careful with that it can boil over real easy, and that's not a pleasant thing to have to clean up by the time you get the sugar in it. Now this was 2½ cups of crushed strawberries. Now one of the nice things about Oklahoma is that we do produce a lot of strawberries here ourselves, and that's probably the best type to choose rather than buying some of those that are available imported from other states and other countries at the different times of year. The great big ones tend to have hollow centers, and they also have a pith in the center, but if you don't get it out it doesn't look real good in the jam, so it's not as attractive.
And I know you had some big ones over here for display with the caps on them. That's an important thing to remember too, isn't it?
Right, it is. You need to leave the cap on as long as possible, not wash the berries until you're ready to use them, because doing either one of those things will cause a deterioration of quality real fast. Okay, now we have 6½ cups of sugar. Now this seems like a lot of sugar, and it is. One of the things a lot of people try to do is reduce the sugar content in their jams and jellies, and what they end up doing is not getting a lower calorie product. What happens when you make jam is you end up with a very thick syrup, and the fruit is basically suspended in that syrup. If you reduce the amount of sugar in a recipe that isn't designed to have that done, you end up just having to cook it longer to concentrate the sugar down to that point. So you end up with something that's got an overcooked flavor with and you get less jam, but it still has the same amount of calories, spoon for spoon.
So really the way to conserve our calories would be the amount that we put on our muffins or
That's one good
toast.
way. Another way is to use some of the low sugar products that are available, the low sugar pectins. This is a traditional recipe, calls for the basic large amount that traditional recipes call for. This we're going to let come to a boil. It needs to come to a full rolling boil, one that can't be stirred down. It will then boil hard for 1 minute, and we need to stir it during that time so that we don't get sugar scorching on the bottom, and we'll see if we can get that to come to a boil fairly quickly. We've now let it come to a full rolling boil and let it boil for 1 minute. Our next step, I'm going to get Steve more involved. We're going to add pectin to this, and this particular one we're using a liquid pectin product. Now this comes in boxes with 2 pouches. We only need 1 pouch, and you kind of have to squeeze it out to make sure that it all comes out. There are 2 different kinds of pectin, and you need to make sure that you use the right kind of pectin for the recipe that's called for in your recipe. Most of the time the recipes that we have call for powdered pectin, and using powdered pectin you add it before you bring it to a full rolling boil. With the liquid pectin, so that it doesn't break down, you bring it to the boil first and then add it, so that you can't switch. You need to use the kind that the recipe calls for. This is simply stirred in at this point. Remember that we're making a real thick syrup out of this, not trying to make a gel like we do with gelled products. Okay, the next step is also relatively simple. We're going to skim the surface of the foam. When you boil the products, you get a lot of this foam on the top, and there's nothing really wrong with it. The problem with it is simply that if it's in the jam, when you put it in the jars, you see these layers of white foam, so it reduces the attractiveness and makes the product a little bit less desirable, and that's the primary reason. So it's more
aesthetic than anything.
Yeah. One of the things to remember about jam, this one, remember, had a lot of sugar, and a lot of people may think that makes it a less nutritious product, and it is from the standpoint of compared to the strawberry itself. But when you consider where you use this and what you are replacing, most of the time people will use less margarine or butter on bread, which is a high-fat product, and replacing it with small amounts of sugar actually can improve the nutritional quality of your diet. So there's no reason to completely avoid jam and jelly products at all.
How's that?
That's not bad. We'll let you get by with that this time. Okay, next step is to get that into the jars. We want to make sure that you've got sterilized jars, because the water bath time on these is less than 10 minutes, and whenever that's the case, we always need to make sure that we use sterilized jars, because they aren't going to be sterilized in the water bath later on. Jams and gel products, because they have such a short water bath time, we fill right up to the brim almost, somewhere between 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch, which is very small amount of headspace. We're using a funnel to help make it a little bit easier, so it's a little bit less difficult to spill that way. That one is pretty good, Steve. You could add just a little bit more to that one to get it up to where we need to have it. Okay, now at this point, what we need to do is get a paper cloth or paper towel of some kind, a little bit damp, and we're going to run it around the rim to make sure that there's no jam on the top of the jar here.
And this is a real crucial step, isn't this?
Right. Otherwise, it may not seal, and then you're going to have to put it in the refrigerator and force yourself to eat it in the next week or 2, probably. Now, we've got the flats, if I can get them apart here. They're in hot water. We poured boiling water over the flats. Let's take the other one out of it's by itself. Now we have a special gadget here to use this. It's simply a magnet on a stick. The advantage to that is, as opposed to using a fork, is that you're not as apt to scratch that rubber compound around there. If you damage that again, you can hurt the seal.
How tight?
Those are tightened what is called firmly tight, which means you just kind of grab it and twist it so that it's tight. Sometimes when they're real hot, you may need to use some kind of a holder with that. You'd fill all the jars at this point, and then they're going to go into a boiling water bath canner. A lot of people are still using paraffin on jams and jellies, and this isn't recommended in Oklahoma because, first of all, most people make it too thick. You need like 1/8 of an inch. If it gets too thick, it weights itself down, pulls away from the sides of the jar, and microorganisms, primarily mold, get in there and you lose the product. This is going to go into the water bath canner. This is a boiling water bath canner. We're going to keep it in there for 5 minutes, but we need to make sure that the water comes back to a boil before you start timing. Otherwise, you'll be under-processed This helps eliminate the problem with mold because it evacuates the air from the top of the jar. You then get that sterilized space there that will prolong the life of the jam if you don't eat it this year.
Now it's starting to boil again. While we do that, Barb, why don't you recap the recipe for our viewers?
Okay, we'll try to do that. We started with 1 pound of red rhubarb and 1/4 cup water, which we chopped finely and cooked together for about 1 minute until it was tenderized. We then measured that to make sure we had 1 cup of the cooked rhubarb, combined it with 2½ cups of crushed strawberries, 6½ cups of sugar, and brought those to a full boil, boiled it for 1 minute, removed it from heat, added 1 pouch of liquid pectin, stirred those together to make sure that they were blended well, skimmed the foam off the top, put it in the jars, leaving about 1/4 inch head space, clean the tops of the jars, put the lids on, put it in a boiling water bath for about 5 minutes.
And so while that's finishing up, can I take a sample over here? I'm really interested in trying this. So that's the finished product there, and I'm going to try this, and we'll just say goodbye while I'm sampling this. Thanks again, Barb, for joining us today.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.